December 7, 1941, Pearl Harbor, Oahu. The first sound is not the bomb. It is the rising whine of aircraft engines over the harbor at dawn. A mechanical hum that does not belong. Seaman First Class Harold Fickinger looks up from the deck of a moored battleship into a pale Hawaiian sky just beginning to brighten over Ford Island. For a split second, the formation above him seems almost graceful. Then the red circles under the wings catch the sunlight, and everything changes. The first explosions tear across Battleship Row with a violence so sudden that men freeze before they move. Steel screams, fuel ignites, windows burst outward in sharp crystal clouds. The harbor, moments ago, calm, as glass convulses under fountains of water and fire, as Japanese torpedo bombers skim low over the surface, their engines roaring so close that men on deck can see the goggles on the pilots' faces. On the USS West Virginia, sailors scramble barefoot across hot steel as the ship begins to list. On the USS Arizona, men are still racing to battle stations when the fatal bomb hits near the forward magazines. At 8:06 a.m., the battleship erupts in a sheet of orange flame so vast it seems to swallow the center of the harbor whole. The concussion slams into neighboring ships like a physical wall. Fragments of metal rain down. Burning oil spreads across the water in black ribbons. For the Japanese naval aviators overhead, this is the image they have come to create. Surprise, paralysis, ruin. Far to the northwest, aboard the flagship, Akagi Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo waits for reports from the strike force that has crossed the Pacific in secret. Around him, officers speak in clipped, careful voices. The plan conceived by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's bold to the point of recklessness has worked. American battleships are burning at anchor. Airfields have been hit. The Pacific Fleet, it seems, has been punched blind in a single morning. In the first rush of triumph, some within Japan's naval command allow themselves to imagine that they have done more than destroy ships. They believe they have broken a nation. To understand that belief, you have to step into the minds of the men who planned the attack. Japan, in late 1941, is already deep in war in China, stretched across an empire that demands oil rubber and steel it does not possess in sufficient quantities. American embargoes, especially oil, have tightened like a noose. If Japan is to seize the resource-rich territories of Southeast Asia, it must neutralize the U.S. Pacific Fleet long enough to fortify a defensive perimeter across the ocean. In Tokyo, many leaders do not think they need to conquer America. They think they need only shock it, strike hard enough, humiliate it deeply enough, and perhaps the Americans' rich democratic divided by oceans will recoil from a long and costly war. This assumption is not madness. It is built on precedent. In the minds of imperial planners, modern industrial societies can be shaken by decisive blows. Morale can crack. Governments can calculate. Negotiations can follow battlefield disasters if the price of reversing them seems too high. And on that December morning, from the Japanese perspective, the price seems staggering. By 10:00 a.m., 8 American battleships have been sunk or damaged. Hundreds of aircraft are destroyed or crippled. More than 2,000 Americans are dead or dying. Smoke climbs over Oahu in towering black columns, visible for miles. Photographs taken from Japanese aircraft show a harbor transformed into wreckage and flame. It looks on film and in memory like victory in its purest form. But there is a problem, one that is not fully visible through bomb sight glass. The carriers are not there. The USS Enterprise Lexington and Saratoga, the fast carriers that will define the naval war to come, are absent from Pearl Harbor on the day of the attack. By accident, by timing, by luck, the most important capital ships in the new age of war have escaped destruction. The Japanese have mauled the symbol of American sea power, the battleship line, but the tools that will carry the war across the Pacific remain afloat. There is another problem, too quieter and even more dangerous. The dry docks are still there. The submarine base is still there. California shipyards, steel mills in Pennsylvania, aircraft plants in Southern California, Michigan, and Texas, railroads, foundries, oil refineries, and thousands upon thousands of workers who have not yet begun to move. In Tokyo, these things are known in the abstract. On paper, American industrial capacity is enormous. Yamamoto himself understands this better than most. He has studied in the United States. He knows the scale of its factories, its natural resources, its mechanical culture. He reportedly warns that if war comes, Japan may run wild for 6 months or a year, but after that, he can promise nothing. It is the most important warning in the Pacific, and almost nobody wants to hear it. Because success has a way of silencing caution. In the days after Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces strike with dizzying speed across the Pacific and Southeast Asia. Guam falls. Wake is attacked. The Philippines are isolated. Malaya and Hong Kong reel under assault. To many observers, including some stunned Americans, the Empire of Japan seems unstoppable. A blade cutting through colonial possessions and naval outposts in a seamless chain of victories. In naval headquarters, on bridges and map rooms, the feeling hardens. The Americans have been hit so hard they may never truly recover the initiative. But grief is not surrender. Humiliation is not collapse. And even as bodies are pulled from the oily water at Pearl Harbor, telephones are ringing in Washington, contracts are being drafted, and surveyors are walking the slips of shipyards that will soon begin producing warships at a pace no admiral in Tokyo can fully imagine. Japan has won the opening blow. What it has not yet realized is that it has awakened the largest industrial war machine the world has ever seen. December 8th, 1941. Washington, D.C. The corridors of the Navy Department do not sleep. Telephones ring without pause. Clerks move with armfuls of reports still damp from fresh mimeograph ink. Officers in wrinkled khaki lean over maps of the Pacific under harsh electric light, redrawing assumptions that had seemed permanent only 48 hours earlier. The losses from Pearl Harbor are still being counted, but in Washington the mood is already shifting from shock to arithmetic. How many ships can be repaired? How many destroyers are already on the ways? How many carriers are under construction? How many months until steel becomes hulls? President Franklin Roosevelt appears before Congress on December 8th and speaks the words that will echo across the century, a date which will live in infamy. But beneath the moral thunder of the speech lies something colder and more consequential. The United States is not debating whether to respond. It is beginning to calculate the scale of response required to fight a war then that will span continents and oceans. And far from Washington, where the numbers become iron, the yards are already stirring. At Newport News, Virginia cranes swing over gray hulls in winter light. At the New York Navy Yard in Brooklyn, welders strike arcs that flash blue-white against black steel. In Philadelphia, in Boston, in Puget Sound, in Mare Island, men who built peacetime ships now find themselves at the front edge of a new kind of battle. Not one fought with rifles or dive bombers, not yet, but with schedules, tonnage blueprints, rivets, and shifts that run through the night. On the West Coast, where the Pacific War will be fed and sustained, the transformation is especially urgent. At the Kaiser Shipyards in Richmond, California, and at yards up and down the coast, contracts multiply with astonishing speed. The names on paper are not romantic. Maritime commission hulls, escort vessels, tankers, cargo ships, repair tenders, floating dry docks. But these unglamorous creations will decide whether Marines land with food and ammunition, or starve on an island the newspapers barely know exists. To Japanese planners, industrial power is something visible in statistics and intelligence estimates. To the Americans now flooding into shipyards, it is sound. The pounding of pneumatic hammers, the hiss of oxyacetylene torches, the groan of gantries moving steel plate through fog and rain, the bark of foremen trying to train thousands of new workers at impossible speed. Many of these workers have never built ships before. Some have never held industrial jobs at all. Farmers' sons from the Midwest, mechanics, longshoremen, draft-deferred specialists, women entering yards and factories in numbers once considered unthinkable. Black workers hired into war industries despite the hard barriers of segregation and discrimination. Retired craftsmen brought back to instruct boys half their age. The workforce expands so rapidly that housing shortages, transportation bottlenecks, and fatigue become wars within the war. And still the yards keep growing. One of the strangest truths of the American response is this: the country does not merely mobilize existing capacity. It manufactures capacity itself. New slipways are built while ships are already under construction beside them. Machine tools are duplicated and standardized. Subcontractors are coordinated across states. Engines, pumps, boilers, electrical fittings, and armor plate are pushed through an industrial chain that stretches so far inland that a man rolling steel in Pittsburgh may be shaping the fate of a naval battle he will never hear about until months later. Meanwhile, back at Pearl Harbor, the Japanese illusion of finality begins to crack. The harbor is still a graveyard, but it is also a workshop. Divers descend into black water thick with oil and debris. Salvage crews clamber over scorched wrecks, cutting through twisted plate with torches. On battleships that should by all appearances be dead forever, sailors and repair gangs begin the ugly labor of resurrection. The USS Nevada, beached after the attack, will return to service. The West Virginia, sunk at her moorings, will be raised and rebuilt. The California will come back. Even the shattered harbor itself refuses to remain a monument to defeat. Dry docks hum. Pumps throb. Temporary patches become permanent repairs. Pearl Harbor, instead of becoming a crippled outpost, begins turning into something more dangerous, a forward repair and logistics base that can send damaged American ships back into combat faster than Japanese intelligence expects. There are still terrible months ahead for the United States. In the Philippines, General Douglas MacArthur's forces are falling back under relentless pressure. At sea, Japanese carrier aviation remains perhaps the finest striking force on Earth. In early 1942, the Imperial Navy seems to glide from victory to victory with terrifying momentum. Rabaul falls. Singapore collapses in February. In the Dutch East Indies, Allied resistance buckles. Headlines across the world speak of a Japanese empire advancing at breathtaking speed. And in Tokyo, that early confidence survives because the map still appears to justify it. Yet maps can lie. They show conquests, not replacement rates. They show captured harbors, not machining tolerances. They show arrows, not assembly lines. The Japanese war effort is formidable, disciplined, skillful, audacious. Its naval aviators are highly trained. Its torpedoes, especially the Type 93 Long Lance, are among the deadliest ever built. Its cruisers and carriers have been honed by years of doctrine and preparation. But beneath these battlefield strengths lies a structural weakness that is harder to see in moments of triumph. Japan cannot lose ships, planes, and veteran crews at the same rate America can replace them. This is the hidden contest Pearl Harbor does not settle. For every Japanese admiral studying operational radii and fuel reserves, there is an American production planner asking how many standardized destroyer escorts can be delivered per quarter. For every brilliant carrier pilot launching from Akagi or Shokaku, there is another American trainee entering a pipeline that will soon expand beyond anything Japan can sustain. The United States is not yet winning at sea in December 1941 or January 1942, but it is beginning to alter the scale of the war itself. And scale, once it gathers momentum, becomes a weapon. By the spring of 1942, the first signs are there for anyone willing to read them. Hulls are moving down slipways with increasing speed. Merchant shipping orders expand. Auxiliary vessels, oilers, tenders, repair ships. Transports begin joining the fleet in numbers that do not make headlines, but make campaigns possible. America's not merely building ships to fight battles. It is building the floating infrastructure to sustain war across 4,000 miles of ocean. The men in Tokyo still see the burning ships of Pearl Harbor. What they do not yet see clearly is the forest of cranes rising behind them on the American coast. May 8, 1942. Coral Sea south of the Solomons. The flight deck shudders beneath Lieutenant Junior Grade William Alt's feet as the USS Lexington turns into the wind. Around him, the air smells of hot oil, cordite, and salt spray. Deck crews in colored jerseys wave and crouch beneath spinning propellers. Ahead beyond the low gray horizon, the Japanese are somewhere out there, hidden beyond the curve of the earth, yet close enough to kill him within the hour. This is the war Pearl Harbor was supposed to prevent. Not a drawn-out industrial struggle, not a brutal campaign of mutual attrition, but a decisive sequence of Japanese blows that would leave the United States too shaken, too disorganized, too far behind to challenge control of the Pacific. And yet here, barely 5 months after the attack, American carriers are already fighting back. The Battle of the Coral Sea is not a clean victory for either side. The Americans lose the Lexington. The Yorktown is damaged. Japanese forces still take ground elsewhere. But strategically, something profound has changed. For the first time in history, two opposing fleets fight a major naval battle without the surface ships ever sighting one another. Carriers, not battleships, now sit at the center of the Pacific War. And carriers are precisely what Japan had failed to destroy at Pearl Harbor. Even then, the margin is thin. American naval power in the Pacific in early 1942 is not yet a juggernaut. It is precarious, improvised, and often one disaster away from collapse. The Enterprise Hornet Yorktown and the recently lost Lexington are not interchangeable pieces on a giant board. They are irreplaceable instruments being driven at extreme risk because there is no alternative. But the United States has something else now. A clock that is beginning to run in its favor. From Tokyo, Admiral Yamamoto sees the same urgency from the opposite direction. He knows time is not neutral. He knows that every month the war continues, American shipyards, aircraft factories, and training programs will expand. Pearl Harbor has bought Japan an opening, not a permanent solution. So he reaches for another decisive blow, one that he hopes will do what December 7th could not. Midway. The plan is elegant in theory and catastrophic in practice. Strike Midway Atoll in June 1942. Draw out the remaining U.S. carriers, destroy them, and extend Japan's defensive perimeter deeper into the Pacific. Once the American carrier arm is shattered, perhaps the strategic balance can be frozen before American production becomes overwhelming. It is, in essence, a second attempt to break the United States before its industry can fully awaken. But by the time the Japanese fleet steams east, the United States has already shown one of its most dangerous traits in war: the ability to absorb punishment, improvise under pressure, and return faster than expected. At Pearl Harbor Shipyard, workers swarm over the damaged USS Yorktown after Coral Sea. Inspectors initially estimate repairs that should take far longer than the Navy can spare. The list of damage is ugly: ruptured uptakes, buckled structure, damaged flight deck systems, battered by bombs and near misses. Yet, Admiral Chester Nimitz does not ask how long proper repairs should take. He asks what can be done now. At dry dock, No. 1 workers descend on the carrier with a kind of organized desperation. Welders crawl through damaged compartments. Electricians rewrote systems. Steel is cut, braced, patched. Men sleep little sweat through uniforms and work under floodlights through the Hawaiian night. In roughly 72 hours, the Yorktown is made fit enough to sail. To Japanese planners, this is nearly inconceivable. A ship mauled in battle should vanish into months of inactivity. It should become a line item in a repair ledger, not reappear at the next decisive engagement. But that is exactly what happens. When American carriers move to meet the Japanese at Midway in early June, the Yorktown is there wounded, hurriedly restored, but there. And on June 4, 1942, the war turns. The morning over Midway is bright and pitiless. On the Japanese carriers, Akagi Kaga Soryu and Hiryu ordnance crews race to rearm planes amid conflicting reports and changing orders. Torpedoes are swapped for bombs, bombs for torpedoes. Fuel hoses snake across hangar decks. Aircraft wait in crowded, vulnerable rows. It is the kind of moment that exists for minutes and decides years. Then the American dive bombers arrive. From high above, dauntless SBDs from Enterprise and Yorktown drop out of the sun almost by accident and perfect timing. Within minutes, 3 Japanese carriers are aflame. Fires race through fueled aircraft and armed ordnance. Secondary explosions rip open hangar decks. Sailors run through smoke thick enough to blind. Steel buckles. Command becomes chaos. By the end of the day, all 4 Japanese fleet carriers committed to the operation are lost. 4 carriers, hundreds of irreplaceable aircraft. Many of Japan's most experienced naval aviators, deck crews, maintainers, and command personnel. The tactical shock is immense. The strategic consequence is even greater. At Midway, Japan does not merely lose ships. It loses trained human capital it cannot easily replace. A veteran carrier pilot is not assembled in a month. A coordinated carrier strike force is not rebuilt from fresh recruits and untested mechanics by issuing new orders. Doctrine experience and institutional memory burn with the ships. America, too, suffers losses. Men die. Aircraft are destroyed. The Yorktown, having defied the odds to reach the battle, is later mortally damaged and lost. But behind the smoke and grief lies a fact that will define everything to come. American yards are still building. The Essex-class carriers are coming. More destroyers are coming. More escort ships, submarines, transports, tenders, and tankers are coming. And the men making decisions in Tokyo are beginning to confront the possibility that Pearl Harbor was not the first blow in a short war, but the opening move in a long one they may have no means to win. January 16, 1943. Newport News Shipbuilding, Virginia. The carrier's hull towers over the dock like a steel cliff in winter fog. Below it, a welder named Frank Coyle pulls down his mask and leans into the seam, the torch spitting white sparks that tumble to the deck in bright cascades. Around him, the sound is constant steel, hammered into alignment cranes grinding overhead. Foremen shouting measurements over the din air compressors coughing like engines, struggling to start. The war in the Pacific may be fought at Midway, Guadalcanal, the Bismarck Sea. But here, inside the shipyards of the United States, another battle is already being won. Not in headlines, not in one dramatic clash, but day after day, shift after shift on slipways, stretching from Virginia to California. By 1943, the American industrial response that began in panic and improvisation has become something more terrifying to Japan, a system. Hull sections arrive prefabricated. Engines, boilers, electrical systems, radar sets, armament, and aircraft elevators are no longer treated as bespoke miracles, but as coordinated components in a war machine designed for scale. Delays still happen. Accidents happen. Quality problems appear. But the overall motion is relentless. The Essex-class carriers, larger, more modern and built in numbers Japan had hoped to prevent, begin joining the fleet. The USS Essex, commissioned in December 1942. Then Yorktown, a new Yorktown CV-10, carrying the old name back into war. Intrepid, Bunker Hill, Hornet. One after another, they slide from slipways and fitting out piers into the Atlantic and Pacific, each one not a single replacement, but a multiplication of American striking power. To a Japanese admiral schooled in the careful husbanding of precious carriers, this is the beginning of nightmare arithmetic. Japan had gone to war with superb naval aviation and highly trained crews, but it had never possessed the industrial base to replace major fleet losses quickly. Even before Midway carrier construction had been constrained by steel shipyard capacity engines, trained labor, and competing demands from Army and Navy procurement. After Midway, those constraints grow harsher. New ships can be laid down, yes. Conversions can be attempted. Smaller carriers can join the fleet. But they cannot restore the balance that existed in late 1941. America, by contrast, is not replacing like for like. It is replacing and expanding at the same time. And it is not just carriers. Destroyers pour into service to screen task forces and hunt submarines. Destroyer escorts, less glamorous but indispensable, thicken convoy protection. Attack transports carry Marines into the Central Pacific. Fleet oilers extend the operational reach of carrier groups across oceans, too vast for short-legged navies. Repair ships, tenders floating dry docks, ammunition ships, hospital ships, and tugs follow behind them in a logistical constellation, without which the sleek, fast warships are nearly useless. This is the thing Japanese planners had underestimated most badly. They understood battleships and carriers. They did not fully grasp the scale of the floating support structure required to sustain a modern transoceanic war, or the uniquely American ability to build that support structure in industrial depth. A carrier can strike. An oiler lets it keep striking. A repair ship puts damaged destroyers back to sea without sending them home. A cargo vessel loaded with bombs, aviation gasoline spare parts, and bulldozers turns a coral atoll into an airbase. In 1943, this network begins to spread across the Pacific like an iron web. And at Guadalcanal, the consequences are written in exhaustion, blood, and rust. The campaign for Guadalcanal, beginning in August 1942 and running into early 1943, is among the clearest demonstrations of what industrial endurance means in practice. For months, both sides hurl ships, planes, and men into a contest fought at the limit of supply. Japanese destroyers race down the slot at night, delivering men and materiel under constant risk. American forces struggle with disease shortages, naval defeats, and air attacks. The fighting is intimate, brutal, and often confused. But underneath the tactical chaos, the deeper balance is shifting. Every month that the campaign continues favors the side that can absorb attrition. The Japanese lose cruisers, destroyers' cargo capacity, transport pilots, mechanics, and veteran aviators in a sequence of actions they cannot fully replace. Their soldiers ashore go hungry. Heavy weapons are left behind for lack of transport. Aircraft fly from overburdened bases with maintenance systems already strained. Fuel becomes more precious. Time, once Japan's ally, begins turning traitor. The Americans suffer terribly too. At Savo Island, Tassafaronga, and in the waters around Guadalcanal, U.S. naval forces pay in ships and lives. Yet, when an American cruiser is sunk, another cruiser may already be fitting out. When a destroyer is lost, another is working up in American waters. When an air group is depleted, training pipelines and factory lines are feeding fresh machines and air crews forward. This does not make the losses less real. It makes them survivable. That is the difference Japan is beginning to understand. In meeting rooms in Tokyo, and truck staff officers can still count victories, still draft plans, still insist on offensive spirit. But the numbers arriving with each month's reports are harder to dismiss. American shipbuilding is accelerating. Merchant construction remains vast. Naval aircraft production is soaring. New radar sets are appearing on ships and aircraft with increasing frequency. The U.S. Navy is learning awkwardly at first, then with growing speed, how to integrate technology, logistics, and mass production into operational power. And once learned, those lessons do not fade. For the officers of the Imperial Japanese Navy, some of whom had believed Pearl Harbor might secure a strategic breathing space, the realization comes in pieces. Not one dramatic confession, but a series of unwelcome recognitions. The Americans have more carriers now than expected. Their damaged ships return faster than expected. Their convoys are thicker. Their escorts are better. Their airfields appear on islands that months earlier were empty stretches of sand and palm. Their fleet is no longer a wounded opponent recovering from surprise. It is becoming an engine. And engines do not feel shock. They do not lose heart. They convert fuel into motion until something physically stops them. By late 1943, the Pacific War is no longer defined by whether the United States can recover from Pearl Harbor. That question has been answered in steel. The only question left is whether Japan can endure what American shipyards have unleashed. June 19, 1944. Philippine Sea. On the bridge of a Japanese carrier, an officer lifts binoculars into the blinding morning glare and watches the first strike groups head east. The sea is calm, almost deceptively gentle. A blue plain stretching to the horizon beneath high summer clouds. Around him, signal flags snap in the wind. Engines thrum through the deck plates. Orders pass in practiced voices. On paper, the Imperial Japanese Navy is still going into battle with carriers, aircraft, and courage. But paper is not reality. Nearly 2.5 years have passed since Pearl Harbor. In that time, America has done exactly what some in Tokyo prayed it would not do. It has turned a moment of humiliation into industrial fury. Now the evidence is no longer distant, hidden in shipyard ledgers or intelligence summaries. It is here directly ahead, floating on the Pacific itself. The U.S. Fifth Fleet appears not as a single force, but as an entire moving system. Fast carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, oilers, supply ships, repair units, radar picket submarines, screening ahead. The Americans are not merely present. They are layered, coordinated, and deep. If one task group is struck, another remains. If aircraft are lost, replacements exist. If ships are damaged, there are tenders, floating dry docks, and repair facilities ready across the Pacific chain. This is what Japanese planners had failed to stop in December 1941. The carriers they missed at Pearl Harbor were one thing. What followed behind them was another. By 1944, new American carriers crowd the Pacific in numbers that would have seemed absurd 2 years earlier. The Essex-class ships form the backbone of a fast carrier fleet that can strike repeatedly, recover, refuel, and strike again. Light carriers add more decks, more aircraft, more operational resilience. Escort carriers slow plane essential protect convoys. Ferry planes support invasions and free the fleet carriers for offensive work. Beneath them all runs the endless pulse of American production, aviation, fuel bombs, spare engines, replacement aircraft, replacement pilots, replacement hulls. Japan comes into the Battle of the Philippine Sea knowing the stakes. The Marianas are under threat. Saipan, Guam, Tinian, if these islands fall, the inner defensive belt is broken, and American bombers will eventually be able to reach the home islands. So the Imperial Navy commits to a major fleet action, hoping at last to inflict the decisive carrier defeat it has failed to achieve since Midway. Instead, it collides with the full consequence of American industrial recovery. The Japanese launch wave after wave, but their aviators are not the same force that struck Pearl Harbor. Too many veterans are dead. too many training programs have been compressed by wartime necessity and fuel shortages. Too much institutional experience has been burned away at Midway the Solomons, and in the grinding attrition of 1942 and 1943. Their aircraft are still dangerous. Their pilots are still brave. But bravery cannot compensate for lost years of training. Across the American fleet, radar screens begin to bloom with incoming contacts. Fighter directors relay vectors. F-6F Hellcats climb to intercept. Anti-aircraft crews wait at their guns' shell clips stacked at their feet, headphones pressed tight against sweat-soaked temples. Then the sky opens. The fight that follows will be remembered by American pilots with a grim kind of humor as the great Marianas turkey shoot. The phrase sounds almost flippant now, but in the air, it is all velocity tracer fire and death. Japanese formations coming in from extreme range are broken apart by radar-guided interceptions before many ever reach effective attack position. Those that survive, the fighters run into dense anti-aircraft fire from ships packed with automatic weapons and proximity-fused coordination that Japan can no longer match. Planes burn, planes ditch, planes vanish into the sea. And as the hours pass, the truth becomes impossible to ignore. This is not the same enemy Japan struck at Pearl Harbor. This enemy has multiplied. For every aircraft the Americans lose, there are factories behind them. For every damaged flight deck, there are repair crews and machine shops. For every exhausted pilot, there is a training command feeding new aviators into the fleet. American strength in 1944 is not just tactical, it is regenerative. The fleet can take losses and remain a fleet. Japan, by this stage of the war, often cannot. When the battle ends, Japanese naval aviation has been gutted. Carriers remain afloat, but without experienced air groups, they are becoming hollow instruments. Ships without the lethal skill that once made them feared. The defeat is not merely operational. It is existential. Somewhere in the minds of Japanese commanders, this must be the point where the old dream of Pearl Harbor finally dies. Not because the attack failed tactically. It succeeded brilliantly on its own terms. Not because America was never hurt. It was hurt terribly. But because the central hope behind the attack that one savage blow might break American will long enough for Japan to secure a favorable balance has been proven false beyond repair. Pearl Harbor did not break America. It clarified America. It stripped away hesitation, unified public rage, accelerated production, and transformed industry into strategy. What emerged from the shipyards of Richmond, Brooklyn, Newport News, Camden, Philadelphia, and dozens of others was not just steel. It was tempo, endurance, the ability to keep coming across distances no other navy could have mastered at that scale. And from there, the end unfolds with dreadful logic. The Marianas fall. American submarines tighten the noose around Japanese shipping. B-29S begin to appear over Japan. At Leyte Gulf in October 1944, the Imperial Navy makes its last great effort and is shattered as an effective fighting force. Some ships fight with desperate courage, but courage now exists inside a collapsing industrial system, starved of fuel aircraft and trained crews. The imbalance that Pearl Harbor was meant to prevent has become absolute. In the final years of the war, Japanese leaders still search for one more reversal, one more shock, one more act of willpower to alter the outcome. But by then, the answer has already been written, not in speeches, not even in battles, but in the slipways and dry docks of the United States. That is where the war was truly lost for Japan. On the morning of December 7th, 1941, the fires at Pearl Harbor made it seem possible that America had been broken in a single blow. By 1944, the Pacific itself had become the proof that the opposite was true. The attack had not shattered the United States. It had awakened its shipyards,